Clara stood in the middle of Granada's Plaza Nueva, while dozens of cameras flashed around her. The man she knew as Yusuf Mansour, a simple businessman from Bahrain, a lover of coffee with cardamom, a man who had been sitting in the corner of her coffee shop every morning for the past month, stood 3 steps away from her, silent. A crowd of reporters was crowding behind him. Someone was shouting in English, "Sheikh Al-Zayed, is it true that you are in Granada incognito?" Someone in Spanish, "Who is this girl? What is her name?" Someone was holding a microphone towards her, but she couldn't even look up. She looked at his face, the same face that had leaned towards her on the roof of her house only yesterday evening, and whispered, "You have changed something in me that I didn't know was still alive in me." And she now looked at this face as if it were a stranger. The headlines in her head ran like the credits of a film. Sheikh Al-Zayed secretly in Granada. $12 billion tycoon secretly having an affair with a Spanish woman. Who is this mysterious girl from the Albaicin? He took a step towards her. "Clara," he began, and his voice trembled as never before. But she had already turned away. Slowly, quietly, as if no longer able to react to anything, she turned and walked away down the narrow street that led up to the old Moorish quarter. There, were a small black cat, an old attic, and a complete lack of understanding of how to live on, were waiting for her. Behind her, cameras flashed. Behind her, there remained the man who was everything to her. And at the same time, he had never been her. Good day, friends. Let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. This story takes place in one of the most amazing corners of Europe, Granada, an ancient Andalusian city where Eastern and Western heritage still blend. A city where, across the river from the ancient Moorish quarter, rises the Alhambra, the palace of the sultans, remembering 1,000 years of history. A story about how one meeting, beginning with a cup of coffee with cardamom, can change not only someone's life, but also what a person believes in. Clara Sanchez Azizi was born in Granada, in the old quarter of Albaicin, where narrow cobbled streets climb the hill, and on every corner there is the scent of incense, jasmine, or fresh tortillas. She was 27 years old, not so young, but not so old either. She was short, with long curly hair, which she usually gathered into a loose bun, leaving a few strands around her face. Her hair was a strange color, not quite black, not quite chestnut, but dark, like the damp bark of an old almond tree. From her Moroccan mother, Clara inherited this hair and an olive skin tone, and from her Spanish father, unusual green-brown eyes in which, as the neighbors said, something always shone, even when she was silent. She lived alone on the top floor of an old 3-story building on Cuesta de Maria Pineda, in the heart of the Albaicin. The attic was small, 1 room, a kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and a balcony the size of a dining room chair. But from that balcony, there was a view for which people paid millions. Directly opposite, across the valley of the Darro River, loomed the Alhambra. The tawny gold walls of the fortress, the crenellated towers, the slender silhouettes of the palace windows. In the evenings, when the sun set, the Alhambra lit up from within with a soft, golden light, and Clara felt as if the entire history of this city was breathing right into her face. She rented the attic for €400 a month from old Mrs. Dolores, who lived on the ground floor and had been a widow for 20 years. Dolores still remembered Clara's parents, remembered her as a little girl running through these streets with pigtails. And when Clara had no one left, the old woman simply said, "Live upstairs. Pay what you can. I won't rush you." The attic was almost bare of furniture, a narrow bed under the window, an old wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves of books almost to the ceiling, and a small chest of drawers inherited from her mother. On the chest of drawers stood 2 photographs in simple frames. One showed her father, Javier Sanchez, still young, in a suit, smiling shyly, his eyes kind. The second showed her mother, Yasmina Azizi, in a white headscarf, with a sad, yet somehow very warm smile. Between the photographs lay a stack of old letters in Arabic, from her grandmother in Fez, who wrote to her granddaughter once a month, in neat handwriting, with the obligatory postscript, "Remember who you are, my daughter's daughter. Remember that the blood of 2 worlds flows in you." Every morning, Clara woke up at 6:30. The first thing she did was open the window and take a deep breath of the moist air, smelling of the morning fog from the river. Then she brewed strong black coffee, added a pinch of cardamom and cinnamon, as her mother had taught her, and drank it standing by the window, looking at the awakening Alhambra. Then a quick shower, simple clothes, a long skirt, a light blouse, a scarf over her shoulders. Sometimes on special occasions, a dark blue dress, the only one she had for decency. A black cat always hung around her feet. She had picked him up 3 years ago on the street near the Sacromonte Cathedral, when he was just a kitten, skinny and with a torn ear. She named him Habibi, which means my beloved in Arabic. Habibi grew into a strong, self-important cat who considered the entire attic his territory, and Clara an extension of that territory. He always walked her to the door, nuzzling his feet, and Clara would always lean over and say something to him in Arabic, an old habit from her mother. Descending the Albaicin hill in the morning was beautiful. The streets were waking up slowly. Old people were drinking their first coffee on their doorsteps. The smell of fresh molinillo, a local sweet almond bread, wafted through the windows. Children were going to school. Cats were basking on the rocks. Clara knew everyone here. She knew whose mother had died, whose granddaughter had been born, who was expecting a grandchild back from seasonal work in France, who had fallen out with their father-in-law. She knew not because she was curious, but because she was the kind of person you want to share things with. She worked at a school for refugee children run by the Puentes, Bridges, Charity Foundation. The school was in an old former monastery on the outskirts of the Albaicin, not far from Plaza San Nicolas, which boasted the most famous view of the Alhambra. The building had been renovated with donations, but was still modest. 3 classrooms, 1 meeting room, a kitchen, and a small courtyard. There were about 60 students, children of Syrian families fleeing the war, children of Iraqis who had left home after losing all their loved ones, several Kurdish families, 1 Palestinian family, a couple of Moroccan children whose parents worked illegally and couldn't send them to a regular Spanish school. Clara worked here as a volunteer. Officially, she was paid €450 a month as an assistant translator. In reality, she was everything: a teacher, a translator, a mother, an older sister, a protector, and a listener. She taught Spanish to Arab children and Arabic to the few Spanish children who came to visit from neighboring schools. She taught reading classes, not the dry alphabet, but stories, fairy tales, and legends of Al-Andalus, the very same Moorish Spain that once existed here in these same mountains. She knew how to talk to a child who had cried 5 minutes earlier because he remembered the destroyed house in Aleppo. She knew how to calm a mother who came with a question about her documents. She knew how to find the right word between the director of the foundation and parents who didn't understand why their child wasn't being accepted into the club. The foundation's director was Rodrigo Valencia, a Spaniard in his 50s, charismatic, gray-haired, with a perfectly ironed shirt and a perpetual smile. He knew how to talk to patrons, journalists, and City Hall. He knew how to organize a charity event so that everyone left feeling like they'd accomplished something great. Clara liked Rodrigo for the first year of his work. Then she began to notice that something wasn't adding up. Trucks arrived with humanitarian aid, medicine, clothing, books. Half went to a warehouse, whose location no one could say. The reports stated that they had given 5 excursions for the children. Clara remembered only 2. The financial reports, which were hung on the common wall, for transparency, stated kitchen renovations, €8,000. But the kitchen remained old, with a scratched table and 1 working stove out of 4. Clara was not an accountant, but she had a very good memory and a very keen nose for lies. Her mother once told her, "Habibti, people who steal always have the same smell on their hands, sweet and sour at the same time." Clara thought that's exactly what Rodrigo smelled like. She tried asking. Rodrigo always answered the same way. "My dear, you don't need to think about it. You're the heart of the school. Do your job, and the numbers are mine." He smiled warmly, placing his hand on her shoulder, and for some reason this touch made her feel uneasy, even though he never did anything inappropriate. In addition to her work at the foundation, Clara worked 3 evenings a week at a small coffee shop on Calderia Nueva Street, El Zoco, which simply means the market. The coffee shop was tiny, with only 8 tables, but incredibly cozy. It occupied a former 16th century shop with thick walls, low vaults, old wooden ceiling beams, and a clay floor. The owner, old Miguel, a friend of her late father, ran the coffee shop more out of love for the place than for money. They brewed real Arabic coffee with cardamom, sold Moroccan tea with mint in glass cups, made simple flatbreads with cheese and honey, and played quiet Andalusian music, a mixture of flamenco and ancient Arabic melodies. Clara worked at El Zoco on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays from 6 in the evening until midnight. Miguel paid her €12 an hour, generous by local standards. She earned about €70 per shift, plus tips. This money was just enough to pay the rent on the attic and for the most modest purchases for herself and Habibi. She rarely allowed herself meat, more often eating lentils with olive oil, flatbread, and tomatoes. On holidays, she bought herself a piece of goat cheese and a bottle of inexpensive local wine, Vino de la Costa. Clara's past was such that many would fall to pieces. Her parents met almost 30 years ago in Tangier, where young Javier Sanchez, a graduate of the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Granada, came on a business trip. A Spanish company was restoring an old mansion in the Portuguese style. Clara's mother, Yasmina, worked in this mansion as a housekeeper. She was 21 then. He was 26. She wore a traditional Moroccan headscarf and spoke with a strong accent. He was shy, quiet, with kind eyes. They did not immediately realize that they had fallen in love. Their cultures seemed too different. Javier was supposed to return to Granada in a month. On the last day, he came to her house, asked her father, who had no family, but his brother-in-law for her. And, to everyone's surprise, the brother agreed. On one condition: Yasmina would preserve her faith, her language, her culture. Javier swore. The wedding was small. Yasmina moved to Granada. Clara was born. Her parents chose a name for her that sounded equally good in both languages. Clara, light, pure. At home, Clara spoke only Arabic with her mother and Spanish with her father. At school, Spanish and English. In the summer, when the whole family went to Morocco to visit her grandmother in Fez, again in Arabic. For Clara, languages were not a subject of study, but a natural part of life, like air, like food, like a mother's prayer at sunset. Clara was a happy child throughout her childhood. Her mother baked her Moroccan baklava for her birthday. Her father took her to the Alhambra on weekends and told her stories of sultans and architects. In the evenings, the three of them would sit on the balcony, her father playing old melodies on the classical guitar, and her mother sang softly, in Arabic, songs that Clara had never heard anywhere else. Everything changed overnight. Clara was 21. She was a third-year student at the University of Granada in the Faculty of Cultural Studies and Anthropology. She wanted to study the dialogue of cultures, Arab and European. She already had her dissertation project approved: Moorish Heritage and Everyday Culture in Contemporary Granada. Her father was as proud of her choice as if she were going to become queen. That day, Javier went on a business trip to Malaga, a consultation on the restoration of an old building on the coast. He was supposed to return late in the evening. At 11 o'clock, the police called. A traffic accident on the A92 highway near Loja. A truck drove into oncoming traffic. Death was instantaneous. My father was no more. Clara remembered how her mother slid down the wall to the floor where the telephone stood, how she sat on the cold tiles in the kitchen and didn't cry, didn't scream, just stared into space. How Clara hugged her, whispered, "Mommy, Mommy, I'm here. I'm with you." And how her mother didn't answer. The funeral was quick and modest. Neighbors came, as did her father's colleagues and Clara's university friends. Two of her father's cousins from Madrid, whom no one had seen before. The priest from the small church of San Jose came. At the very end, a lone man in a black suit appeared, an old friend of her father's, also an architect, Ignacio, whom Clara remembered vaguely. He approached her mother, kissed her hand, and said something quietly. Her mother did not look up. After the funeral, emptiness set in. Clara tried to hold on. She continued going to university, writing her dissertation, cooking at home. But her mother no longer cooked. Her mother no longer smiled. Her mother almost never left the bedroom. Her mother almost never ate. Clara cooked her soup, brought her tea, read aloud the Arabian Nights that her mother had once read to her. Her mother stared at the ceiling and was silent. 3 months after her father's death, doctors discovered that her mother had breast cancer. It was in a late stage. The doctors frowned and spoke to Clara separately. "We'll try everything possible, but you have to be prepared." Clara cried that night as she had never cried before. She cried alone because she couldn't cry in front of her mother. She could barely hold on. They started treatment, chemotherapy, hospitalization. Clara dropped out of university, took an academic leave, sold her father's car to pay for what the insurance didn't cover, sold part of her father's library, the rare books on architecture he'd collected his entire life, sold her mother's ring, the one her father had given her for their wedding. Her mother cried when she found out, but she needed more and more money. Mother struggled for 8 months. In April, when Granada already smelled of blossoming orange trees and the Alhambra stood in a foggy haze, Mother died. Not from cancer, as the doctor said, from grief. She herself told Clara this a few days before her death. "Habibti, I loved your father too much. My heart does not want to live without him. Forgive me. Know that I love you more than life itself, but I can't go on. Take care of yourself. Remember who you are." They buried her next to her father. Clara was left alone at 22. The first year after her mother's death was a blur. Clara remembered it poorly. She remembered that she hardly left the apartment. That old Senora Dolores brought her food every day, that her grandmother from Fez called every other day, crying into the phone, inviting her to come over. But Clara couldn't leave her parents' graves. She remembered that she stopped drinking coffee because the smell of cardamom reminded her of her mother. She remembered that she picked up a black kitten on the street and named it Habibi, and that this kitten was the first living creature to which she was able to bond after her loss. In her second year, Clara began to return. Not to university. There was no money for a dissertation and none in sight. To life. She got a job at Miguel's coffee shop. She began teaching at the Puentes Foundation, first twice a week, then full-time. She began drinking coffee with cardamom again. Now it wasn't the scent of loss, but the scent of memory, warm and alive. She wasn't looking for love. She didn't want a serious relationship. Sometimes some tourist in a coffee shop would try to flirt with her, invite her to a restaurant, invite her somewhere. She would politely decline. Not because she had closed her heart forever, but because she didn't want something temporary. She saw how her parents loved each other until their last breath. She knew that things could be different, and she didn't want anything less. Yusuf Al-Zaid saw Clara for the first time on Monday morning, September 4th. He wasn't planning to go to the coffee shop that day. He wasn't planning to go anywhere that day at all, except to the office of the director of the Puentes Foundation, where he had an appointment at 11. But as he walked down the streets of the Albaicin to the appointed place, he suddenly stopped in front of a small carved door with the inscription El Zoco, and felt that he couldn't pass by. Because from there came a smell that he hadn't smelled for many years. The smell of real coffee with cardamom, freshly ground, brewed slowly, the old-fashioned way. Yusuf Al-Zayed was a tall man of 42, 6 feet 85, slender, with that special bearing that usually belongs to people who are used to being looked at. He had dark, close-cropped hair, graying at the temples, a short, neat beard, also graying, and deep, dark eyes, of which a financial magazine once wrote, "A look that has more desert in it than in the desert itself." On his left arm, there was a long, thin scar from his elbow almost to his wrist, the result of an old fall from a horse when he was 10 years old and rode an Arabian with his father for the first time. That day, Yusuf was wearing a simple, dark suit with no identifying marks, a white shirt without cufflinks, and black shoes that were well made, but not flashy. On his wrist was a simple watch, a black leather strap. None of the tourists passing him on the narrow streets of the Albayzin would have guessed that this man runs the investment fund Al Zayed Global, with assets of around $12 billion. That his family owns banks, hotels, ports, and energy companies in 7 countries. That Financial Times journalists are waiting for his comment on every major move in the Persian Gulf real estate market. No one would have guessed, because Yusuf made a special effort to make sure that no one would guess. The story that brought him to Granada was long and painful. He was born in Dubai, the son of Sheikh Ahmed Al Zayed, one of the first businessmen to begin building the Emirati economic empire. Yusuf was the eldest son. He studied at a private school in Switzerland, then at Oxford, specializing in international economics. At 26, he returned home. At 30, he headed the family investment fund. Everything turned out the way it does for people who, from childhood, know what is expected of them. He worked 18 hours a day, traveled the stock exchanges, met with ministers, bought companies, sold companies, joined boards of directors. He married at 32. His wife's name was Dahlia. She was from a noble family, educated in Paris, loved art, played the piano, spoke 4 languages fluently. Yusuf didn't fall in love right away. Marriage was partly a family decision. But then, living with her, getting to know her from the inside, he loved her in a way he didn't think he was capable of. Dahlia was quiet, kind, with an amazing sense of humor. She laughed at his seriousness, could whisper a joke in his ear in the midst of an important business dinner that made him squirt into his glass. She wanted children, lots of children, a house full of laughter. 2 years after the wedding, Dahlia became pregnant. It was a girl. Yusuf learned for the first time in his life what it was like to count the days. Dahlia prepared for the birth. She arranged the nursery. She chose a name. They had almost decided. Salma, in honor of Yusuf's grandmother. The birth went wrong. Complications. Bleeding. Doctors, the best of the best, fought all night. By morning, neither wife nor child was left. Yusuf didn't remember the next 3 months. He only remembered that he couldn't enter the room where the prepared crib stood. He couldn't look at Dahlia's piano because he remembered her fingers. He couldn't eat the food she once loved. He quit his job for 6 months. He started traveling the world without any reason. Patagonia, Iceland, Japanese villages, Himalayan monasteries. Nothing helped. He returned to Dubai a year later, a different man. Silent, withdrawn, with new gray hairs in his beard, with a new depth in his eyes, and with an emptiness inside that could not be filled. 8 years have passed since then. Dahlia's mother and mother constantly hinted that it was time to marry again. They had already found him a bride, a young woman from a very wealthy family, Yasmina Al-Maktoum, 26 years old, a beauty, raised to be the wife of a major businessman. Yusuf never agreed, and never outright refused. He simply delayed, worked, developed new areas of the foundation. He now invested most of all in charity, schools for refugees in various countries, hospitals, programs for orphans. The Granada project, the Puentes Foundation for Refugee Children, was one of his personal projects, begun 5 years ago. He personally financed the school, donating around €250,000 a month to its operations. Not for publicity. No one in his circle knew about this project except his personal financial auditor, Ahmed. Yusuf wanted one school in the world to function the way he dreamed of in his youth, where children from different cultures were allowed not to survive, but to flourish. Ahmed was supposed to go to Granada in May to conduct a scheduled audit of the project, to verify the foundation's reports with reality. Ahmed never made it. On the mountain road between Malaga and Granada, according to the official version, his car was blown off a cliff by a rockfall. His body was found 2 days later. Yusuf flew in for the funeral, laid flowers on the grave, and left without saying a word to anyone. A month later, his younger brother Marwan handed him a packet of documents and said calmly, looking him in the eye, "Yusuf, I suggest you quietly transfer management of the fund to me, in a friendly way. Otherwise, I will be forced to act through the shareholders." Yusuf realized that a coup was underway. Marwan had always envied him, his older brother. Marwan was ambitious, ruthless, and smart. And, Yusuf realized it then, Marwan probably had something to do with Ahmed's accident, because the audit threatened to reveal some mechanisms that Marwan wanted to hide. Yusuf refused a peaceful transfer. Marwan declared war on Yusuf from within the company. Then Yusuf decided to go to Granada himself, not as Sheikh al-Zayed with his entourage and 10 cameras, but as an ordinary man. He got an old backup identity from his foundation's passport office, the kind they kept in case of an emergency evacuation. Yusuf Mansour, a Bahraini citizen, a mid-level entrepreneur interested in real estate and educational projects. He bought some simple things at a Dubai mall. He rented a simple SUV in Malaga and arrived in Granada on Sunday evening. I stayed at a small guest house, Casa de la Luna, in the Realejo neighborhood, not far from the Albaicin. The guest house was run by an elderly couple, Señor Pablo and Señor Carmen. They didn't ask any questions. For €30 a night, they gave me a clean room with a large bed and an old table, and in the morning, they brought coffee and bread to the room. Yusuf felt at peace there. On Monday morning, September 4th, he left Casa de la Luna at 8:30. He was supposed to go up to Albaicin, sit in a cafe, look at the area where the foundation's school operates. He wanted to get a feel for the place. Then, at 11, he had a meeting with the foundation's director, Rodrigo Valencia, to whom Ahmed was supposed to tell that he was coming for an audit. Rodrigo knew that instead of Ahmed, Mr. Mansour, a representative of the Dubai donor, would be coming. Yusuf walked slowly along the narrow streets that climbed upwards. The morning was quiet. Granada was just waking up. The old bakery on the corner smelled of molinillo. Arabic words drifted from the open door of an apartment. Moroccan parents were waking their children. And suddenly, in the middle of Calderia Nueva Street, he stopped. A smell he hadn't smelled for probably 20 years was coming from a small coffee shop with a carved wooden door and a brass plate that read, El Zoco. It was the smell of Grandma's coffee. His grandmother, Salma, after whom he wanted to name his daughter, was the person little Yusuf would run to when his parents were busy with their own affairs, and they were almost always busy. His father was young, ambitious, in negotiations every day. His mother was always busy with receptions and obligations. And Grandma Salma lived in an old house in the Al-Bastakia quarter, in the very heart of old Dubai, where coral houses with wind towers, narrow streets, the shade of date palms, the spirit of what was before oil, still remain. Every week, his mother brought little Yusuf to his grandmother for a day or two. His grandmother greeted him at the door, hugging him the way only very beloved children are hugged, tightly, lingeringly, as if afraid to let go. She was short, a little plump, with a warm smile and large brown eyes. She spoke to him not in English, as in expensive schools, but in Arabic, the old-fashioned way, with expressions no one remembered anymore. She told him stories she had heard from her grandmother, and she from hers. And she made coffee. Yusuf remembered every detail. She had a special bronze mill, an ancient one with a lid shaped like a mosque dome, brought from Yemen as part of her dowry. She never bought ground coffee, only beans, always fresh, always the same variety. She would seat little Yusuf on a low cushion next to her, and they would grind the beans together. First the grandmother would turn the handle of the mill, then he, with his still, small hands. She would count out the cardamom, exactly 6 beans, always 6, never 5 or 7. 6 is a sacred number, baby. 6 is correct. Then she would add a pinch of ground cinnamon, just a little, just to add some color. And she would put the little copper Turk on the fire. The fire had to be slow. Grandmother never left for a second. She told little Yusuf what the old people say. Coffee, left unattended, gets offended and leaves. She lifted the Turk 3 times, not letting the coffee boil completely. Boiling water is rude, little one. Real coffee doesn't tolerate rudeness. Then she poured it into small cups with oriental patterns and brought them to the low table, where dates, nuts, and pieces of fresh bread already stood. They drank together. Little Yusuf from his tiny cup, into which his grandmother poured just a little. Grandmother from her larger one. They were silent or talking, and time flowed more slowly next to her than anywhere else. Grandmother Salma died when Yusuf was 14. He was still studying in Switzerland, but they didn't tell him right away, so as not to interrupt his studies. Only a week after the funeral, he came home and ran to her house, but distant relatives were already living there. The mill was gone. No one knew where it was. The date palm in the yard withered that same year, as if it, too, couldn't survive the loss. Yusuf stood alone in the yard and understood. The world in which Grandmother Salma lived was over forever. Since then, he'd tried this coffee everywhere. In Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Yemen, Morocco, in the old coffee shops of Istanbul. He'd never found it. Everyone knew how to make it right. No worse than in the coffee shops of luxury hotels. But that aroma, that taste, that special silence over a cup, they weren't there. Yusuf thought that aroma had remained forever in his childhood and would never again cross his path. He opened the door and walked in. Inside it was dimly lit, cool, quiet. Thick stone walls, low vaulted ceilings, old wooden beams, a clay floor. 8 tables scattered about in disarray. Quiet music was playing in the corner, an old Andalusian guitar mixed with an Arabic violin. Behind the counter was a young woman in a dark green apron, her back to him, doing something. Yusuf approached the counter. The woman turned around. He saw her face. A strange, unique face. Olive skin, dark curly hair gathered in a loose bun, but one strand still escaped and fell on her temple. Green-brown eyes, calm, attentive, without the forced smile that all waitresses in tourist places wear. She looked at him as if he were just a person, Not a tourist, not a potential check, but a person. "Good day," she said softly. "What would you like?" Yusuf was about to order in Spanish, as he had planned, but instead, looking at her, smelling her grandmother's coffee, feeling the warmth of the old vaulted ceiling, he suddenly said in Arabic, "Kahwa mahil, liao samachti." "Coffee with cardamom, please." She was not surprised. She was not taken aback. She looked up at him and answered in Arabic, real Arabic, with a barely perceptible Moroccan accent, so pure that his heart sank. "Tfadal, sit. Please, sir, sit down. I'll bring it in a minute." Yusuf stood and looked at her for a few seconds, unable to look away. She was slightly embarrassed under his gaze, but did not look away. Then she smiled, a warm, short smile, and turned to the coffee machine. Yusuf sat down at a table by the window, from where he could see the street. He mechanically took his phone out of his pocket, but didn't open it. He just held it in his hands and watched as she made coffee. She did it right, really right. She ground the beans in an old hand mill, not an electric one. She counted out the cardamom by hand. She put the small copper Turk on low heat. She didn't leave for a second. She lifted the Turk 3 times, not letting the coffee boil completely. Then she poured it into a small ceramic cup with an oriental pattern and brought it on a tray with 1 date and a glass of water. He thanked her, also in Arabic. She nodded, went back to the counter. Yusuf didn't drink for a long time. He simply looked at the cup, at the steam rising above it, inhaled the aroma. And for the first time in 8 years, or maybe even in his entire adult life, he didn't want to go anywhere. He didn't want to talk on the phone. He didn't want to solve problems. He just wanted to sit. He drank the coffee anyway, slowly, like the elders did in Dubai. Then he paid, left a tip, and asked her, "Is it possible to come here again?" She smiled slightly again. "We work every day except Sunday. Come on over." He went outside, raised his head to the sky. The high September sun was rising over the Albayzin, and went to meet Rodrigo. The meeting at the Puentes Foundation was brief and strange. Rodrigo greeted Yusuf warmly, set a small table with tea and cookies in his office, and showed slides on his laptop, beautiful slides, with photos of laughing children, with graphs of budget growth, with descriptions of plans for the new year. Everything looked flawless. Rodrigo spoke smoothly, answered questions confidently, and avoided topics that might have been uncomfortable, not rudely, but masterfully, like a man accustomed to talking with patrons. Yusuf listened attentively. He was an experienced man. He knew how to see when he was being spoken to according to a script. There was something about Rodrigo that didn't fit the picture. Too smooth. Too many beautiful numbers without detailed explanations. Too quick confidence in the answers, as if they had been rehearsed. Towards the end of the meeting, Yusuf politely asked. He would like to see the school from the inside. Not today. There are lessons today he doesn't want to disturb. Maybe tomorrow or next week. And preferably quietly, without an official tour. He would like to see how things really work. Rodrigo tensed for a second, but then he smiled. "Of course, Mr. Mansour. Absolutely. Come whenever you like. I'll arrange everything." Yusuf left. Walking back down the streets of the Albayzin, he caught himself thinking that for the first time, he didn't want to go back to the guest house right away. He turned toward Plaza San Nicolas, sat on a stone bench by the fence, looking at the Alhambra opposite. Then he went back to El Zoco, just for a walk. And through the window, he saw that the young woman behind the counter was there again. He went in. "Another one?" she asked quietly. "One more," he said. This is how it began. Yusuf started coming to El Zoco every morning, and every evening, sometimes for lunch. He always sat at the same table by the window. He always ordered the same thing: coffee with cardamom, water, dates, or flatbread with cheese. He looked out onto the street. Sometimes he read something on his phone. Sometimes he just sat, not looking at anything. The young woman behind the counter served him silently, friendly, without unnecessary words. She didn't ask who he was or what he was doing in Granada. She didn't flirt. She was professional and warm at the same time. On the second day, he finally asked her name. More precisely, he was going to ask her name a little later, but something happened that sped up everything. It was Tuesday morning, around 11 o'clock. Yusuf was sitting at his table by the window, already drinking his second cup of coffee, reading financial news on his phone. The coffee shop was almost empty. 3 customers, including him. Clara was standing behind the counter, moving something. The door swung open. A small boy ran into the coffee shop, about 7 years old, skinny, wearing a worn blue t-shirt and short shorts. He was covered in tears, disheveled, his face red from tears. He stopped at the threshold, looking around as if looking for someone, and seeing Clara, rushed towards her with a shout. In Arabic, in the Syrian dialect. "Hanan! Hanan! Mom is missing! I can't find Mom!" Clara instantly appeared in front of him, leaned over, and hugged him the way one hugs only one's own children. And she also spoke to him in Arabic, but in neutral Arabic, with a slight Moroccan accent, quietly, evenly, soothingly. "Yusuf, darling. Yusuf, look at me. I'm here. Breathe. One more breath. Everything will be okay." Yusuf, the one sitting at the table, froze. His gaze was literally glued to the stage. He saw how this unknown girl, who just half a minute ago had been holding a rag for the bar, suddenly became a mother to this Syrian boy. He saw her palm on the back of his head, her fingers wiping away the tears under his eyes, her forehead pressed against his forehead. He heard her voice, not loud, not pitying, but the kind an adult speaks to a child when they want to bring them back to reality from panic. He saw how the boy, who had just been choking with sobs, gradually stopped crying. Yusuf didn't understand everything, but he understood the main thing. This child was from a refugee family. This girl was somehow connected to the school where he had come to sort things out, and she was talking to this child in a way that no one had ever spoken to him, even in childhood. Clara led the boy by the hand to a table in the corner, poured him a glass of water, gave him a small flatbread. She sat down next to him on the floor so as to be at his height. She asked calmly, "Where did you see your mother last?" "What was she carrying?" "Did she take the bus or walk?" The boy answered, sobbing, but no longer panicking. A few minutes later, a young woman in a black headscarf ran into the coffee shop, out of breath. A young mother, also in tears. She saw her son, rushed to him, hugged him, and both mothers, his own and the one who had replaced her for 10 minutes, stood and hugged each other, quietly crying. Yusuf sat silently, not drinking coffee. Something inside him, something that had been frozen for 8 years, suddenly cracked, gave way, and something living entered into this crack. When the mother and son left, Clara returned behind the counter, slightly trembling, with an apologetic smile. She looked in his direction. "Sorry about that. We have a boy at school, Yusuf. He got lost on the way this morning. He knew I worked here. He came running here." Yusuf nodded silently. Then he said very quietly, looking at her attentively, "What is your name?" "Clara," she said. "Clara," he repeated. "It's a beautiful name. It makes you glow even when you're silent, doesn't it?" She smiled a little wider than usual. "That's what my father said when he was choosing my name." "Your father," said Yusuf, "is an intelligent man." "He was smart," she answered quietly. "He's gone." Yusuf was silent for a second. Then he said very simply, without pretense, "Sorry, I didn't know." "You couldn't have known," she replied. "It was just a long time ago. Don't worry." She turned away, but something had already happened between them. He felt it. He saw that she was not like the others. He saw that she had a difficult history behind her, and he saw that she knew how to bear it with dignity. On the fourth day, he introduced himself, not entirely truthfully, of course. "My name is Yusuf Mansour," he said. "I'm from Bahrain. I'm here for a short while on business." "What business?" Clara asked, not looking up from her coffee pot. "I'm studying educational projects. Maybe I'll finance something in this city." She looked up. There was something in her gaze, not curiosity, but understanding. "So you've probably already met Puentes?" "Yes," said Yusuf. "I was there this morning. Do you know this place?" Clara nodded. "I know. I work there, as a volunteer." Yusuf couldn't help but smile. He didn't believe in fate or coincidences, but sometimes life threw up such things that even he stopped. "Tell me about him," he asked. Clara was silent for a moment. Then she sat down across from him, for the first time in all these days, rather than standing behind the counter talking. She talked for about 20 minutes. She talked about her children, about the Syrian girl, Maryam, who spoke Spanish for the first time after 6 months of silence, about the Palestinian boy, Hamza, who draws the city where he was born from memory, about the Kurdish twins who have not been separated for a minute since they lost their parents. Yusuf listened, and he realized that for the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about money, about numbers, about negotiations. He was thinking about faces, about the faces of children he had never seen, but whose stories suddenly felt like they were his children. He asked cautiously, "And how is all this financed? It's really expensive. A school for 60 children?" Clara was silent for a second. Then she said cautiously, "There is some donor. We don't know exactly who. Rodrigo, the director, says that it's a private patron who wants to remain in the shadows. He gives a lot. 250,000 euros a month, I think. Rodrigo said this once." Yusuf nodded silently. He didn't tell her, "It's me." He didn't tell her anything. But her face, when she said this, became different for a second. Thoughtful, slightly wary. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "Fast. Too fast." "No, it's just—" She looked at him carefully. "Sometimes I think this money, it doesn't all get through." Yusuf froze internally. Then he said calmly, "Tell me." She hesitated. Then, slowly, quietly, as if afraid that someone would hear her through the walls, she told him what had been building up inside her for months. About humanitarian aid, half of which was going somewhere. About repairs that weren't being done. About the rates that were indicated in the reports, but there were no people at these rates. About her own questions, which Rodrigo always deflected. Yusuf listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked into her eyes and said one thing. "Thank you for telling me." "Why do you need this?" she suddenly asked. "You're just a tourist." "I'm not just a tourist," he said. "I came here to study the best places to invest my money. These things are important to me. If a project is corrupt, I won't support it." She nodded. She seemed to accept this explanation. They said goodbye. He went to his guest house. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling and thought, so this is where his money had been going for the last 5 years. Not just for the children. He didn't know how much had been stolen, but it was clear they had stolen a lot. And they had been stealing for a long time. And perhaps it wasn't just Rodrigo who was behind this. Perhaps there was a whole chain of events behind this. And perhaps, Yusuf couldn't shake the thought, somewhere in this chain was his brother Marwan, who knew about the Puentes project and probably knew that the money wasn't just going to the children. Yusuf decided not to rush. He had to see everything with his own eyes. He had to document everything. And he had to do it before Rodrigo suspected anything. The next day he arrived at the foundation. Rodrigo greeted him warmly, giving him a tour of the school, prepared in advance, with model children, model classes, a model lunch. Yusuf smiled and nodded. Inside, he noticed every detail that didn't add up. The sterilely clean kitchen, which clearly wasn't working. The computers in the classroom, still in their boxes, as if they'd just arrived that day. The teachers, whom Rodrigo introduced as regulars, spoke to him as if they were the first time. While he was walking around the school with Rodrigo, Clara was working with her children in another wing of the building. He saw her through the open door of one classroom, sitting on a small child's chair in a circle of 6 children. They were all wearing uniforms, the simple blue uniforms that the foundation gave out for free. Some of the children were very young, about 5 years old, some older, about 9. One boy, Yusuf recognized him, was the same Yusuf his mother had been looking for in the coffee shop. He was sitting on the floor near her feet, holding on to the hem of her skirt as if it were a life preserver. Clara read to them from a book, an old, tattered book of Arabian tales. She read loudly, expressively, changing her voice for different characters. The children listened, transfixed. One boy, the smallest, stuck his thumb in his mouth. One girl's mouth dropped open in surprise when Clara, in the voice of a genie, said, "Ask me for 3 wishes, but choose them wisely." Yusuf paused in the doorway for a few seconds. He wasn't looking at the children. He was looking at her face. It was a face he'd never seen in the coffee shop. In the coffee shop, she was warm but reserved, slightly closed off. Here, in this classroom, among 6 little people who had lost homes, families, entire countries, she suddenly opened up. Her eyes glowed. Her hands gestured, showing a flying carpet, a dragon, an old man with a gray beard. Her voice changed from a whisper to a loud cry, and back again. The children were in her palms. They laughed, gasped, cried out. One boy closed his eyes in delight, as if the images in his head were brighter than reality itself. Yusuf suddenly realized she is not just a volunteer, not just an assistant. For these children, she is the safe haven to which they come after everything they have been through. She is what their mother could once have given them, but for most of them, she can no longer. And she does this without pathos, without, "I am doing a great thing," without the desire to receive a reward. She does this because for her, it is natural. Rodrigo also stopped, followed his gaze, and smiled. "This is Clara, our volunteer, a wonderful girl, half-orphan, who speaks Arabic. The children adore her." "I see," Yusuf said. "How long have you had her?" 5 years, 4.5 to be precise. If it were longer, life has been tough for her. Her parents died. She dropped out of school. She lives in an attic in Albaicin with her cat. Modest, hard-working. Yusuf listened silently, and he understood that this was one more thing he now had to do, protect her from Rodrigo, because he saw an evil light in the director's eyes when he spoke about her. Rodrigo knew that Clara was asking questions, and he was getting ready to get rid of her. That evening, Yusuf came to El Zoco again. Clara was already waiting for him. She set the table, put out coffee with cardamom, without saying anything. She just smiled. He was grateful. They started talking more. Every evening, when the coffee shop was less crowded, Clara would sit down with him, sometimes for just 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Miguel, the old owner, didn't say anything. He saw that something was going on. He was a friend of her father's. He wasn't curious. He just watched from afar and was probably glad that Clara had started talking to someone for a long time again. Yusuf asked her questions, carefully, unobtrusively, about her parents, about her Moroccan mother, about her Spanish father, about her dream to restore the school of cultural dialogue that her mother dreamed of, about how she sees the future. Clara spoke, not at once, not all at once, but every evening a little more. Yusuf saw how her face came to life when she spoke about culture, when she spoke about the Arab world and the European world at the same time, about how they are intertwined, about how they are not opposed to each other, but could complement each other. She spoke beautifully, without pomposity, like a person who had thought about this all her life. Yusuf felt like he was listening to another person for the first time in years. Something about this girl awakened something in him that he thought had died with Dahlia. He started telling some of the truth about himself, too. That he grew up in Dubai. That he lost his wife 8 years ago in childbirth. That he never had a wife again. That he works in the world of money and is tired of it. That he has a younger brother with whom he has a difficult relationship. Clara listened attentively. There was no pity in her eyes, no curiosity, no special sparkle that appears in women when they learn of wealth. She simply listened, like a human being. And, listening, she quietly placed her hand on his hand for a second, and then removed it. And this gesture was warmer and more precious to him than everything he had received in the world of money in 8 years. 2 weeks later, he showed her the Alhambra. They went there on a Saturday morning before the main tourists arrived. Yusuf bought tickets. Clara initially refused. "I'll show you myself. I grew up here." But Yusuf insisted. They walked slowly through the famous Nasrid halls, through the inner gardens of the Generalife, through the small courtyards with fountains. Clara told him, not as a guide, but as someone for whom this was home. She showed him the Arabic inscriptions on the walls, old sayings from the Quran, and verses that the Arabs had carved into stone 8 centuries ago. She read these inscriptions aloud, fluently, with the correct intonations. Yusuf stood nearby and listened. In one of the rooms, the smallest, there was an Arabic inscription, almost invisible between the patterns. Wala khaliba illa Allah. And there is no winner but Allah. Clara read it quietly. Yusuf closed his eyes. He learned this phrase from his grandmother. To hear it here, in the middle of Spain, in a strange city, from a woman he met 3 weeks ago in a small coffee shop, it was too much. He turned to Clara. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. He just looked at her. She understood. She looked at him in response, and both were silent. That day, as they walked back to Albaicin across the bridge over the Darro River, they held hands for the first time. Carefully, like schoolchildren, without words. Clara herself didn't understand what was happening to her. She had been alone for 5 years. She didn't believe she would ever love anyone again. She thought that part of her life was already closed. But then this man came, quiet, profound, with pain in his eyes, with respect for her culture, with an interest in her thoughts, with a sense of humor that manifested itself at the most unexpected moments. And for the first time in many years, she felt like she was living, not just surviving. She didn't ask herself questions about him. She saw that he was a wealthy man, but not one who boasted about it. She saw that he had a past that he hadn't told her everything about. She saw that he was honest with her about the main things, how he looked, how he listened, how he was silent. She told only 2 people about him, old Señora Dolores, who nodded approvingly. "Your mother would approve, Habibti. I can see it in his eyes." And Miguel in the coffee shop, who said briefly, "He's a good man. Your father would understand him." A month after their first meeting, on a Thursday evening, they were sitting on the roof of her house. Clara made him Moroccan tea with mint, simple food, olives, goat cheese, flatbreads. They talked until midnight. First, about culture. Then, about life. Then, about pain. Yusuf told me more than he had told anyone in 8 years. He told me about Dahlia, about how he still remembers the smell of her hair, about how he didn't pray after her death, about how, for the first time in all these years, he feels something again, other than work and emptiness. Clara listened. She took his hand in hers. She held it for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Yusuf, I know what loss is. I buried both my parents before I was 23. I know what it's like to live with someone who is no longer alive. But I also know something else. My mother told me before she died, Clara, loving again doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying with you everything that was and still living. I didn't understand this for a long time, and now I'm starting to." Yusuf looked into her eyes. Her green-brown eyes reflected the Alhambra, glowing opposite in the evening light. He leaned towards her, and for the first time in 8 years, he kissed a woman. The kiss was long, quiet, without haste. It contained everything: gratitude, pain, hope, fear, liberation. When they pulled away, Clara smiled quietly. Yusuf was silent, stroking her hair. That night, he didn't stay with her. he went to a guest house, not because he didn't want to, because he understood. She deserves time. She deserves honesty. And he wasn't completely honest with her. He walked the streets of Albaicin until dawn. He understood that he had to tell her everything, that he couldn't go on like this, that she deserved to know who he really was, where her questions were going, who she told about the foundation. He decided, tomorrow evening he would tell her everything. But tomorrow everything didn't turn out as he planned. On Friday morning, Yusuf was working in the guest house, preparing documents. Over the past few weeks, secretly, with the help of his people in Dubai, he had pieced together a complete picture of the foundation's corruption. Rodrigo wasn't just stealing, he was siphoning money through a network of shell companies in Portugal. Some went even higher, apparently to Dubai, to Marwan. Yusuf was ready to act. He scheduled a meeting for Monday with the Spanish police, the prosecutor's office, and representatives of the International Commission on Charitable Foundations. He intended to publicly expose Rodrigo, and through this, uncover the chain of custody leading to his brother. He didn't take one thing into account. Marwan worked faster than he thought. Marwan learned that his older brother had disappeared from Dubai for a month. Marwan bribed his people at the fund and received information that Mr. Mansour from Bahrain was most likely Yusuf. Marwan decided to strike first. On Friday afternoon, the editorial office of the Spanish weekly Diario Sur received a package from an anonymous source. Photographs of Yusuf al-Zayed in Granada, details of his stay under a false name, a short video of him leaving a coffee shop in the Albaicin with a young woman, shot from a distance. Yusuf didn't even notice he was being followed. And a note. One of the richest men in the Persian Gulf, secretly in Granada. Secret Spanish lover. Investigation ongoing. By Friday evening, the news had been picked up by all the Spanish tabloids. By Saturday morning, it had made it into international publications. By Saturday afternoon, journalists, paparazzi, and ordinary onlookers had gathered in Plaza Nueva, where, according to rumors, the Sheikh usually emerges in the mornings. Clara found out about it all by chance. She was on her way to her morning shift at the Puentes Foundation. On the way, she stopped at a small kiosk for a newspaper. She loved reading local news. On the front page of Diario Sur was a photo of her and Yusuf. More precisely, Sheikh al-Zayed. The headline, $12 billion tycoon in secret affair with Spanish woman from Albaicin. Clara stood at the kiosk for several minutes, unable to move. The seller, old Pedro, looked at her with concern. "Are you okay, baby?" Clara silently put the newspaper on the counter, paid, and left. She didn't go to the foundation. She went to Plaza Nueva. Something in her demanded to see him. Not to ask, not to find out, just to see. Perhaps to hear from him himself. Yes, it is I. And to decide what to do with it. She came to the square. There was already a crowd there. Dozens of cameras. At first, no one bothered her. She was unrecognizable, an ordinary local girl. She stood in the crowd, waiting. And an hour later, she saw him. Yusuf left the Casa de la Luna guest house. He had also learned about what had happened that morning, and he still decided to go to Plaza Nueva because he was looking for her. He had to tell her everything himself before she found out from someone else. He was late. She already knew. He saw her in the crowd. Their eyes met. One of the reporters shouted, "It's her! It's her!" And the crowd turned to face Clara. Flashes, microphones, shouts. Clara stood her ground, her eyes glued to his face. He was looking too. And then came the very scene with which this story began, the scene that Clara could never remember calmly afterwards. He took a step towards her. "Clara," he began, but she had already turned away and walked away. She walked along the streets of Albaicín without looking back, along her familiar alleys, past old ladies on their thresholds, past cats on the stones, past her coffee shop, El Zoco. Miguel stood in the doorway, saw her face, didn't ask anything, just nodded quietly. She went up to her attic. She opened the door. Habibi nuzzled her legs. She sat down on the floor by the threshold, hugged the cat, and cried for the first time in a long time. Yusuf tried to reach her that same day. He tried the following days. He went to her house. Señora Dolores wouldn't let him in. "Clara asked me not to let anyone in." He went to El Zoco. Miguel simply said, "She's not here right now. Not now, my friend. Give her some time." He wrote her long messages. She didn't answer. He didn't call because he understood. It was impossible to speak to her now. But he didn't give up. He didn't fly back to Dubai. He stayed in Granada and started doing what he had planned, but with even greater determination. Because now, it was not just for the children, but for her too. On Monday, he met with the Spanish police, the prosecutor's office, and the International Commission. He showed all the documents, all the evidence, all the transfers, all the fictitious accounts. The Spanish police opened a case that same day. On Wednesday, Rodrigo Valencia was arrested in his office at the Puentes Foundation. The charges are grand theft, money laundering, and breach of trust. The damages, according to preliminary estimates, are approximately €4.5 million over 5 years. At the same time, Yusuf flew to Dubai for a short time. Alone, without security, without announcements, without anyone to meet him at the airport. He arrived at night, took a taxi, and went straight to the old family home in the Hurrer neighborhood, where his mother lived. His mother opened the door herself. She already knew he was arriving. His assistant had told her. She stood on the threshold in a dark dress with gold embroidery, short, with gray hair slicked back, with tired eyes. She saw her son and began to cry. Not loudly, but quietly, as if she no longer had tears left for loud crying. Yusuf hugged her. She was small compared to him, thin, trembling slightly in his arms. They sat down in her large living room. His mother poured him coffee, the right coffee, with cardamom, but not like Grandma's, and not like Clara's, her own. She was silent for a long time while Yusuf drank. Then she said quietly, "Yusuf, I know what happened. Marwan is my son, and I love him. But I'm not blind. I've seen everything for a long time. I just hoped that you could sort this out between yourselves without a big scandal. It didn't work out." "Mom," Yusuf began. "Don't make excuses," she raised her hand. "You don't have to make excuses to me. You have to make a decision and stick to it. Marwan is your brother. I want him alive, free, and out of jail. You are my son too. I want your foundation clean. Find a way. You're smart." Yusuf nodded. Then his mother suddenly looked him straight in the eyes and added, And, Yusuf, they told me about this girl in Granada. I saw her picture in the newspaper. She's beautiful. Is she the one you wrote to me about in those short letters where you didn't want to tell me anything? Yusuf was surprised. He didn't know that his mother had noticed his reserved mentions in the letters. He nodded. Yes, her name is Clara. She changed me, Mom. I can't explain it. I can feel again. For the first time in 8 years. The mother was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Bring her to me, one day, when all this is over. I won't interrogate her. I just want to see the woman who gave my son back to me." Yusuf kissed her hand. He couldn't remember the last time he had done this. His mother stroked his cheek. The next morning, he went to Marwan's, not to his home, but to neutral territory, to a quiet private room in one of the family-run hotels, where he summoned his brother with a short message. "Come, in an hour, alone. Otherwise, I'm calling the police." Marwan arrived. He was 5 years younger than Yusuf, a little shorter, with sharper features, with that predatory energy that those around him confused with charisma. He entered the office, sat down opposite his brother, and tried to begin with his usual condescending smile. "Yusuf, my brother, what a drama!" "Shut up," Yusuf said shortly. He placed a stack of documents in front of Marwan. A thick one, almost 300 pages long. Financial transfers, fictitious companies, copies of letters, call recordings, those that had been obtained legally, witness statements, information that Marwan had been involved in the rockfall that killed Ahmed, not directly, but through intermediaries. Marwan leafed through the documents. The smile disappeared from his face. He turned pale. He was silent for a long time. "You have 2 choices," Yusuf said calmly, looking at his brother. "Either you sign your resignation from the fund, completely and forever, renounce your claims, accept any supervisory position I give you, forfeit the right to manage the family assets, and I'm not enforcing these documents. Never. Mom won't know you were involved in Ahmed's death. The Spanish prosecutor's office won't receive evidence. You'll retain your freedom and your name. Or you go to trial, under Dubai law, with a full package of evidence. Your wife will no longer be the Sheikh's wife. Your sons will not be heirs. Your house will become a prison for 20 years. Marwan was furious, shouting something about injustice, about how Yusuf had always been his father's favorite, that the entire fund should have gone to him, that Yusuf didn't understand anything about business, that Yusuf was a weakling who had fallen in love with a European girl. Yusuf was silent. He just sat and looked at his brother. When Marwan ran out of breath, Yusuf said, "Sign or leave. You have 12 hours to decide." Marwan signed 10 hours later. A week later, he was officially removed from leadership. Yusuf regained control of his fund. All this took a month and a half. During this time, Yusuf never left Granada for longer than 2 or 3 days. He rented a small room in the Alhambra Palace Hotel and worked from there. Every morning he came to El Zoco. Miguel always made him coffee with cardamom, without a word. Yusuf sat at the same table by the window, drank coffee, read documents, met with lawyers. Clara was not there. She stopped working at the coffee shop until everything calmed down. Meanwhile, Clara lived in the attic. For the first 2 weeks, she hardly went out. Señora Dolores brought her food. Miguel passed on some news through Dolores. Rodrigo had been arrested. Millions in embezzlement had been discovered. The money would probably be returned to the fund. The children were continuing their education. Clara listened, nodded. She didn't ask about Yusuf. Although every evening, looking out the window at the glowing Alhambra, she thought about him. She cried. Then she stopped crying. Then again. It was grief, but not the kind she was used to. It was living grief, because she understood. He hadn't died. He was nearby, in this very city. And she herself was choosing not to see him. She understood that he wasn't playing with her. That if he had been, everything would have turned out differently. She would have seen it. But she couldn't forgive the fact that he hadn't been honest with her from the very beginning. That she had told him her life, her pain, her dreams, and he had remained behind a mask. That every question he asked about the foundation wasn't just a question from an interested philanthropist, but a question for someone who personally concerned him. She felt used, even though she knew it wasn't entirely fair to him. A month and a half later, she packed her suitcase and left for Morocco to visit her grandmother. Miguel drove her to Granada airport at night. Yusuf found out about this the next morning. Miguel himself told him. She went to Fez, to her grandmother. I think you should go after her. Yusuf didn't hesitate for a second. He took the next flight via Madrid to Fez. He arrived a day later. The taxi took him to the old quarter of the Medina, to the narrow streets where Clara's grandmother lived. He arrived in the evening. The taxi dropped him off at the main entrance to the old Medina of Fez. The only way forward was on foot, because the narrow streets were too narrow for cars. Yusuf walked along cobbled alleys lined with mosques, tanneries, coppersmith shops, and the smell of fresh bread baking from outdoor ovens. He hadn't been to Morocco for many years. The last time he came was with Dahlia, 7 years ago. Everything here remained the same. Nothing had changed here for centuries. And this, strangely enough, calmed him. He grew up in a world where everything changes every month. New skyscrapers, new projects, new rules. Here, the stones on the streets still remembered the grandfathers of today's residents. He asked in a small shop where Senora Fatima, Clara's grandmother from Spain, lived. The seller, an old man with a gray beard, looked at him carefully, then nodded. Go straight ahead, third alley on the right, the house with the blue door and the oleander at the entrance. Yusuf reached the house. The blue door was small, carved, with a copper knocker in the shape of the hand of Fatima, an ancient amulet. At the entrance stood a pot of pink oleander, still blooming in September. Yusuf stood for a few seconds, gathering his courage. Then he knocked. The door opened slowly. An elderly woman stood on the threshold, wearing a dark blue dress with embroidered edges and a white headscarf. She was probably 70 or a little older. She was short, thin, with a posture as straight as a young reed. Her face was covered with wrinkles, but her skin retained its olive tint. And her eyes, Yusuf couldn't take his eyes off them, were exactly like Clara's. Green-brown, calm, attentive, as if they saw right through a person without any questions. She looked at him for a long time, without inviting him in. Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf said in Arabic, bowing his head slightly. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, the grandmother replied, adding a slightly more formal tone, as if testing him. Who are you? My name is Yusuf, I know Clara. Grandma didn't smile. She looked at him for a few more seconds. Behind her, in the depths of the house, somewhere water was bubbling in a saucepan. Quiet music was playing. An old Arabic recording. Or maybe someone was singing. It smelled of rose water and cumin. I know who you are, she said calmly. She told me. Yusuf was silent. He waited for the next word, like a sentence. She didn't tell me the way you tell about a bad person, Grandma continued, but she didn't tell me the way you tell about a good person either. She told me the way you tell about a person they don't understand. And that, you know, is the worst thing. Because there's no hiding from it. Not for her. Not for you. Yusuf nodded. He didn't know what to say. I've lived many years, said Grandma. I buried my husband. I buried my son-in-law, Clara's father. I buried my daughter. I know what grief is. And I know what a lie is. A lie is also a death, only a small one. Do you understand? Yusuf nodded again. You lied to my granddaughter, said the grandmother. Not out of malice, not out of calculation, out of fear. But you lied, and now you stand at my door and want her back. I don't know what kind of person you are. Clara says you only lied to her about her name, but you were honest about the main thing. I don't know if that's true. I only know my granddaughter is not a toy. She's been through a lot of pain, too much for such a young woman. She buried her father at 21, her mother at 22. She's lived alone for 8 years because she couldn't imagine anyone understanding her. If you came to play, leave now. If you came to ask for forgiveness and offer her something serious, come in, we'll see. Yusuf stood, his gaze fixed on hers. For the first time in years, he felt like someone was speaking to him not as a powerful man, but as a grown man, demanding an answer. In his entire adult life, no one had ever spoken to him like this. Everyone had avoided him, feared him, flattered him, sought his favor, never looked him in the eye so directly. I've come to ask for forgiveness, he said, and I'm ready to offer her everything I have if she agrees. Not money, myself. Grandma was silent for a few more seconds. Then she nodded slightly. Yusuf awaited the verdict. I don't know what kind of person you are, said Grandma. Clara says you only lied to her about her name. But you were honest about the main thing. I don't know if that's true. I only know my granddaughter is not a toy. She's been through a lot of pain. If you came here to play, leave now. If you came here to ask for forgiveness and offer her something serious, come in, we'll see. Yusuf nodded. For the first time in many years, he felt that someone was speaking to him, not as a powerful person, but as a grown man from whom an answer was demanded. I've come to ask for forgiveness, he said, and I'm ready to offer her everything I have if she agrees. Not money, myself. Grandma stepped aside. Come in. Clara was sitting in the courtyard of an old house. The courtyard was small, paved with blue and white Moroccan tiles, with a fountain in the middle and 3 orange trees in the corners. She was drinking mint tea in a glass cup. She heard footsteps and looked up. She saw him. She was not surprised. It was as if she had been waiting. Yusuf stopped in the doorway of the courtyard. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Clara, I know I have no right to ask for anything. I'm not making excuses. I was wrong not to tell you the truth from the very beginning. I keep wondering why I didn't tell you. At first, because I was afraid of scaring you. Then, because the closer we became, the more terrible it was to admit. I'm a coward. I understand that. And I ask you for one thing, to allow me to ask for forgiveness normally, face to face, not by messages, not through servants, but here, now." Clara looked at him silently. Then she slowly nodded. She pointed to the seat opposite. He sat down. Grandmother quietly went into the kitchen, closing the carved door behind her. They talked for hours. Yusuf told everything, from the very beginning, from Ahmed's death to Marwan's betrayal, from the Puentes school and its secret financing, from that first morning when he entered El Zoco and smelled his grandmother's coffee. He didn't embellish anything, didn't justify anything. He spoke like a man who had nothing left to lose. Clara listened. Sometimes she asked again. Sometimes she was silent for a long time, looking into the fountain. Once she cried, quietly, without a sound. The tears simply flowed down her cheeks. He didn't try to console her. He understood that he had no right. By the end of the conversation, she said, "Yusuf, I can't give you an answer now. I thought about you for a month and a half. I cried about you for a month and a half. I was offended. I was angry. I remembered every word we said and asked myself what was real and what wasn't. I need time." "As much as needed," he said. "Tell me one thing," she asked. "If I hadn't turned away from you in the square back then in the Albaicin, if I had stayed then, would you have told me the truth?" Yusuf looked into her eyes. "I was going to tell you that very evening, before it became news. I didn't have time." Clara nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. Yusuf stayed in Fez for a week, not with Clara, but in a hotel in the New Quarter. He gave her space. Sometimes they met in the evening for a few hours, walked through the Medina, talked. Clara slowly thawed. She saw he was not the one portrayed in the newspapers. He was not a sheikh in the sense that the word is used in the tabloids. He was a man who had lost his wife, who was hiding from his own family, who had secretly paid for refugee children for 5 years because he wanted one school in the world to work properly. He was a tired, kind, deep man who one morning went into a coffee shop for the smell of his grandmother's coffee. On the 8th day, in the evening, they were sitting on the terrace of the grandmother's house, watching the sun set over the Medina of Fez. Clara turned to him and said, "Yusuf, I'm ready to try, but not like in the Albaicin. For real, with complete honesty, with my right to say stop if something goes wrong." "I agree to everything," he said. "And one more thing," she added. "I don't want to be a sheikh's wife, followed by security guards and paparazzi. I don't want to live in 7 houses in different countries. I don't want to be on the covers. My home is Granada, my Albaicin, my school, my attic, my cat Habibi. I want to be with you, but still be myself." Yusuf smiled quietly. "Clara, that's exactly why I want to be with you. That's exactly why I found you. Not so I could change you, but so that maybe you could help me change a little myself." She laid her head on his shoulder. For the first time in a month and a half, and they sat in silence for a long time, watching the light go out over Fez. They returned to Granada together 2 weeks later. In the Albaicin, they were met by Señora Dolores, Miguel, and their neighbors. No one asked any unnecessary questions. Rodrigo was already in prison, and the Puentes Foundation had appointed a new director, Clara's former colleague, an honest woman named Marta. The International Commission confirmed that all the stolen funds would be returned. The children continued their education. Yusuf didn't move into Clara's attic. There was barely enough room for one person and a cat there. But he bought the small house next door, or rather, half a house 2 streets away, and spent 6 months renovating it in an authentic Moorish style, restoring the old floors and ceilings. The house became theirs. Clara didn't move out of the attic completely. She kept it as her own space, where she could always retreat when she needed to be alone. Habibi moved into the new house because it had a garden where he could catch butterflies. Yusuf didn't give up his business, but he rebuilt his life. He moved his main office to Geneva, where he could work via video conference. He flew to Granada every month for 2 or 3 weeks. He only went to Dubai when absolutely necessary. He handed over some of the management of the Al Zayed Global Fund to professional managers, retaining only strategic decisions for himself. The wedding was modest. In the summer, 8 months after his return, the small Generalife garden next to the Alhambra, Yusuf negotiated with the administration by making a large donation to the museum. Obtaining permission was not easy. The Alhambra Gardens are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and private events are not held there. But the administration made an exception when they learned who the two were. A woman who had spent her life studying Granada's Moorish heritage, and a man who secretly financed a school for Arab children in her city. There were no more than 30 guests. Grandmother Fatima arrived from Fez. She sat in the front row, in a simple white dress and a white headscarf, with a posture straight as a young reed. And for the first time in a long time, there was no shadow of sadness in her eyes. Señora Dolores cried so much that she had to be taken out of the room 3 times so that she could drink water. Miguel, the old owner of El Zoco, wore a suit for that day that he probably had not worn for 30 years. Yusuf's mother arrived from Dubai. At first, she was reluctant to go, but in the end, she agreed. She arrived in an expensive abaya, surrounded by security. But, seeing Clara and hugging her, she quietly whispered in Arabic, "My child, you are warm. I see why he chose you." Several of Yusuf's friends arrived, not business partners, but those rare people whom he considered real. Marta, the new director of Puentes, arrived. The school teachers and several parents of refugee children, with whom Clara had worked for 5 years, came. Miguel gave a toast, the shortest and most touching in their lives. To Javier and Yasmina, who look down on us today and know that their daughter is happy. Clara burst into tears. Yusuf took her hand and held it for a long time. Clara wore a simple white dress, embroidered with Moroccan motifs along the edges. The dress had been sewn by an old craftswoman in Fez, a friend of grandmother Fatima, especially for this day. Clara had live jasmine in her hair, following her mother's tradition. Around her neck was a simple gold chain with a tiny silver crescent moon, a gift from her grandmother, a family heirloom worn by Clara's great-grandmother at the end of the 19th century. Yusuf was wearing a simple gray suit. He still had the same simple watch on his wrist as on the first day in the coffee shop. He had deliberately not worn anything expensive. He wanted to be wearing nothing of Sheikh al-Zayed that day, but only Yusuf, the one who had come into the coffee shop for the smell of coffee. The ceremony was conducted by an old Andalusian priest in a Moorish garden, not entirely religious, but free, incorporating the traditions of both cultures. They recited poetry in Arabic and Spanish. They exchanged rings, simple gold ones without stones, but engraved inside, "Wa la ghaliba illa Allah," and there is no winner but Allah, the very same phrase Clara had recited to him in the Alhambra on their first walk together. After the ceremony, when the guests had gone to drink tea in the shade of the orange trees, Yusuf took Clara to a quiet corner of the garden where a small fountain gurgled, surrounded by jasmine. He looked into her eyes and said quietly, "Clara, I promise you one thing. Not wealth, not luxury, not foreign homes. I promise you that every morning, for the rest of my life, I will make you coffee with cardamom, just like my grandmother taught me. And I will look at you while you drink it, and I will know that I am the happiest man in the world." Clara didn't say anything. She just took his hand and pressed it to her chest, where her heart was beating. After their wedding, they began building what Clara had dreamed of her entire life, a large school for cultural dialogue. She found an old building in the Albaicin, a former monastery in need of renovation. Yusuf bought it and financed a complete restoration. The school was named Escuela Puentes, School of Bridges, in memory of the old foundation, but now on a new, clean foundation. Clara became director. Children from more than 20 countries, Arab, European, African, studied at the school. They taught languages, cultures, history. They held monthly festivals of various traditions. Teachers from all over the world came to the school. 2 years later, The Guardian wrote about it. 3 years later, Clara was invited to speak at a UNESCO conference in Paris. A year after their wedding, Clara became pregnant. She found out about it one morning when Yusuf left for Geneva for 2 days on foundation business. She was sitting in the kitchen of their house, drinking morning tea with mint, and suddenly felt something change inside. She went to the pharmacy that same day, bought a test, returned home, and with trembling hands took 2 strips. She sat on a small bench in the bathroom and cried, quietly, happily, with the kind of cry that women cry when they learn that life has given them what they did not dare ask for. Habibi came and lay down on her legs, as if he understood. She didn't tell Yusuf on the phone. She wanted to tell him face to face. When he returned 2 days later, she met him at the door, hugged him, and simply whispered in his ear in Arabic, "Habibi, we're having a baby." Yusuf froze. He didn't say a word for several seconds. She felt his heartbeat under her cheek, quickly, as if he was running. Then he slowly sank to his knees, hugged her stomach with his arms, and buried his face in it. And he cried. For the first time in all the time she had known him, he cried for real, silently, his whole body shaking. She stood and stroked his hair and understood. He was crying at the same time from joy and from fear and from Dahlia, whom he still carried in his heart. She didn't say anything. She just stroked. Yusuf was very quiet for the first few months. He did everything right. He took her to doctor appointments, bought vitamins, read pregnancy books, and set up a nursery in their home in Albaythin. But Clara could see he was living in constant tension. Every doctor's visit was like an exam. Every test was like a death sentence. He didn't say it out loud, but she understood he was afraid that what happened to Dahlia would happen again. He was afraid of losing another woman, another child. One night, in the 5th month, they were lying in bed, and he suddenly said quietly into the darkness, "Clara, if something goes wrong, if I have to choose, promise me, you, only you, the baby comes later, you're the first. I can't survive a second time." Clara was silent for a long time. Then she turned to him, took his face in her hands, and said firmly, "Yusuf, you shouldn't think like that. We won't choose anything. Everything will be fine. Do you hear? Mom told me, true love isn't afraid of the future. True love just moves forward, without looking into the hole. Let's move forward, okay?" He nodded, hugged her, didn't fall asleep until the morning. Clara chose to give birth not in Dubai, where Yusuf's mother had suggested, nor in Switzerland, where Yusuf himself wanted to go for the best doctors. She chose Granada, the San Cecilio University Hospital, where her own mother had once died. "Yusuf," she said, "I want our daughter to be born in my city, in the city where I was born. There are good doctors here, and I want it that way." He agreed. But he invited 2 additional specialists from Barcelona and 1 from Geneva, just to be on the safe side. Clara didn't object. The labor began early in the morning. Clara woke Yusuf quietly so that he wouldn't panic. "Yusuf, my dear, I think it's time." He jumped up as if stung. He grabbed his pre-packed bag, the car keys, forgot to put on his jacket, went back for the jacket, forgot the bag, went back again. Clara laughed, looking at him. "Yusuf, breathe. Everything is fine. We have time." They arrived at the hospital. The doctor examined Clara and nodded. "Everything is going well. The labor will be long, 10 to 12 hours. Make yourself comfortable." Yusuf didn't leave her side for a minute. He held her hand. He wiped her forehead. He looked at the monitor showing the baby's heartbeat. He counted the beats as if something depended on it. Clara, between contractions, stroked his face. "Yusuf, everything's fine. Can you hear me? My heart is beating." The doctor is calm. "Everything's fine." He nodded. But inside him was Dubai 8 years ago. The night, the doctors with tired faces, the words, "Mr. Al-Zaid, forgive me." He returned to that moment again and again, and forced himself to return to this one, where Clara, alive, warm, breathed next to him. 11 hours later, a few minutes earlier than predicted, Yasmina was born. The doctor placed her on Clara's chest, still bluish, covered in mucus, with her eyes closed. She took her first breath and screamed, loudly, offended, demanding. Clara laughed and cried at the same time. Yusuf stood next to her, looked at her, at his daughter, at her tiny fingers, and couldn't believe that all this was real. Then they put Yasmina on the scales, then washed her, wrapped her in a white sheet, and returned her to her mother. Yusuf was able to hold her in his arms for the first time. She was tiny, 3 kilograms, 200 grams. She already had a little dark hair and green-brown eyes, exactly the same as Clara's, like grandmother Fatima's, like Clara's late father's. He held her and suddenly realized, this is Clara's child. This is the child of the woman he loves. This is not Dahlia, not Selma, not the past. This is the future. And this future is here, in his arms, breathing. He cried for a long time, quietly. Clara looked at him from the bed, also crying, and everything was fine. 2 years later, they had a son, Javier, named after his Spanish grandfather. The birth this time was easier, also in Granada, also at San Cecilio. Yusuf hardly panicked this time, but he still secretly prayed in the corner of the room while Clara was going through contractions. Javier was born cheerful, with a strong voice, and the same shock of dark hair as his sister. The children grew up speaking 3 languages fluently from birth: Spanish, Arabic, and English. They had 2 homelands and 2 worlds, and they belonged to both. Yusuf, standing one evening on the roof of their house in the Albaicin, looking at the Alhambra glowing opposite in the evening light, said to his wife, "Do you know what's most surprising to me in this whole story?" "What?" Clara asked, laying her head on his shoulder. "That all my life I thought I was in control of my destiny, that I was the one who made the decisions, that I was the one who chose. But it turned out that the most important decision in my life wasn't me. It was my grandfather, who taught my grandmother how to brew coffee with cardamom, and my grandmother, who taught me how to recognize that scent as a child, and you, who brewed it in a small coffee shop in Granada, thousands of miles from Dubai. All of them together brought me to you. I didn't choose. I simply came." Clara smiled, quietly, warmer than on that first day at the coffee machine. "Yusuf," she said, "do you know what my mother said before she died?" "What?" She said, "Clara, a real meeting always has 2 parts. One is prepared for you, the other is prepared by you, and only when both are ready does the meeting happen. You were ready a long time ago, and I was ready a long time ago. We just had to find a way." They stood hugging each other, watching the lights on the towers of the Alhambra go out. Somewhere in the garden, Habibi was meowing. Downstairs in the nursery, Yasmina and Javier were sleeping. Years passed. Yasmina turned 12, Javier 10. Escuela Puentes became known in Europe as a model project for intercultural education. Clara traveled to conferences several times a year. Yusuf partially withdrew from active business, leaving only strategic work with the foundation. His family conflict with Marwan was not finally resolved, but Marwan, removed from financial affairs, no longer posed a threat. Yusuf's mother came to Granada every year, fell in love with Clara and her grandchildren, and accepted the fact that her son lived in this strange European village, as she affectionately called it. One autumn evening, when a warm rain was falling over the Albaicin, and the children were sitting by the window watching the rain stream down the glass, Yasmina turned to her mother and asked, "Mom, tell me again how Dad came to the coffee shop for the first time?" Clara smiled. She had told them this story 100 times already. How Dad came, how he ordered coffee in Arabic, how he looked at her as if he saw someone from another life. The children adored her. She called it the story of the smell. That day, Clara began, sitting down next to them, it was September, a warm morning, just like this one. I was working in a coffee shop. It was before we built the school, before Dad became a dad, before you and Javier. Back then, I thought my life was almost set. Work, a cat, a little solitude. And then a man I'd never seen before walked in. Javier, the younger one, turned around. And he ordered coffee with cardamom. Yes, he ordered coffee with cardamom, in Arabic. I answered him in Arabic, and he looked at me as if for the first time in his life he saw someone who understood him. How did you recognize him? Yasmina asked. I didn't recognize him, Clara said quietly. I didn't recognize his name. I didn't recognize his status. I only recognized one thing. This man is real. Behind all the masks, behind all the deeds, he's the real deal. And I realized that if I let him go now, I'd regret it my whole life. And Dad? And my dad once told me that he realized the same thing, only in different words. The children sat quietly, looking at the rain. Then Javier asked, Mom, what if Dad hadn't come into the coffee shop then? What would have happened? Clara was silent for a long time. Then she said, I think, my dear, we would have met anyway, just somehow differently. Because real meetings, as your grandmother Yasmina used to say, always have two parts, and when both are ready, the meeting happens, one way or another. It rained all night. In the morning, Granada woke up clean, fresh, with the scent of wet orange trees. At the Escuela Puente school, the children were sitting in their classrooms, preparing for cultural history lessons. In the garden near the house, Habibi was playing, chasing fallen leaves. In the kitchen, Clara was brewing coffee, strong, with cardamom, just like her mother made it, just like Yusuf's grandmother made it, just like they make coffee in the small coffee shops of the Albaicin and Fez and Marrakesh and Old Damascus. All over that land where two cultures once lived together. Yusuf stood by the window and looked at her. She was 38. The first gray hairs had already appeared in her hair. In her eyes, there already lived the calm depth of a person who had gone through great losses and great joys. She was everything to him. He came up to her, hugged her from behind, and rested his chin on her shoulder. Clara. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Ahmed hadn't died, if I hadn't had to go myself, if I had never come to Granada. And what do you think? Yusuf was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, I think even bad things sometimes lead to the most important things. I don't want to say that Ahmed's death is the price. I never do. But I know he would have understood. He was a kind man, and it seems like somewhere he's smiling now too. Clara turned to him, kissed him. Outside the window, Granada was beginning its usual day. Neighbors were walking along the streets of Albaicin. Children were hurrying to school. In the El Zoco coffee shop, Miguel, still as old, still as quiet, was preparing the first morning coffee. Another 20 years passed. Miguel, an old friend of Clara's father, finally passed away, quietly, at night, in his small apartment above the coffee shop. Clara cried at his funeral as one cries for a loved one. The El Zoco coffee shop was bought by a young couple from Morocco and promised not to change a thing in it except for the tiles on the floor. They promised to keep the wooden beams and the copper plates on the walls, and the coffee recipe. Clara often came there to this day. She would sit at that very corner table by the window and drink coffee with cardamom. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with Yusuf. He was already in his 60s. She was in her 50s. The dark color had long since disappeared from his hair. His hair had become completely gray. But the look with which he looked at her was the same as on that first morning in September. Yasmina turned 30. She married a young Spanish architect, Pablo, whom she had met at the University of Granada. She worked as a teacher of Arabic culture at the Escuela Puentes school, which her mother had founded. She already had her own son, little Yusuf, named after his grandfather, a tiny creature of 3 years old with dark curly hair and the green-brown eyes of his great-grandmother, Fatima. Javier went to study in Paris, worked at his father's foundation, and prepared to take over management. He combined both sides of the family, his mother's Spanish restraint, his father's Eastern depth, and the international scope of his grandmother Fatima, who, incidentally, lived to be 92 and passed away quietly in her sleep, surrounded by her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. One summer, Yasmina brought little Yusuf Jr. to stay with his grandparents in Granada for a few weeks. Every morning, Clara made her coffee, and little Yusuf Jr. sat on a low cushion next to her, wide-eyed, staring at the bronze chesve and the hand mill, exactly the same as the one Grandma Salma had in Dubai, only new, brought from Yemen by Yusuf Sr. about 20 years ago, especially for their home. Clara taught her grandson the same things that her mother had once taught her, and Yusuf Sr. had been taught by his grandmother. She counted out cardamom, 6 grains. She said, "6 is a sacred number, my dear." Little Yusuf Jr. repeated with a serious face, "Shh, 6." She added a pinch of cinnamon, put the Turk on low heat, and said, "Coffee left unattended gets offended and leaves. Never leave those you love, my dear. Never leave." Little Yusuf Jr. nodded, as if understanding. She lifted the Turk 3 times, pouring a tiny amount into a small child's cup. Her grandson drank, wincing. It was bitter for his age, and she laughed, kissed him on the dark curl on the top of his head, and said, "Never mind. In 20 years, when you meet your girlfriend, you will know how to make her coffee properly, and that will be your magic." Yusuf Sr. stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them. He remembered his grandmother Salma. He remembered little Clara, whom he had never known. He remembered the first morning at the El Zoco coffee shop, and he understood. The circle had closed. Everything that had happened in his childhood, everything that had happened in her childhood, everything that had happened in Plaza Nueva under the flashes of cameras, everything that had happened in Fez on the terrace of his grandmother's house, all of this led here, to this small kitchen with a bronze chesve and a great-grandson who was learning to make coffee. He came up to them and hugged them both, his wife and grandson, from behind. Clara closed her eyes. Little Yusuf Jr. laughed. Outside the window was Granada. Sometimes an entire destiny is hidden behind the most ordinary cup of coffee. Sometimes behind the most humble waitress hides a person who can change someone's life with one smile and one word in another language. Sometimes behind the most famous name lies a tired, lonely person who is simply searching for a scent that will remind him of who he is. Sometimes two people meet, not because fate decided it in advance, but because both of them, each in their own way, through their wounds, through their efforts, through their loyalty to themselves, became who they needed to become in order to know each other. If you think about it, science says the same thing. Robert Waldinger, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running scientific project on happiness in the world, which has been running since 1938 and covers more than 80 years of observing the destinies of thousands of people, summed up the conclusion of all these decades of work in one sentence. He said, "The main predictor of happiness and a long, healthy life is not money, not success, not a career, not fame. It is the quality of our close relationships. People with warm connections live longer, get sick less often, feel better in old age. And this is probably the most unexpected discovery of modern psychology, because it contradicts almost everything we hear every day about how to be happy." Yusuf, who spent 8 years spending his $12 billion to fill the void in his chest, discovered one morning in a small coffee shop on a narrow street of the Albayzin that what he was looking for could never be bought. And Clara, who thought that her life was already set, work, attic, cat, discovered that life only begins when we allow ourselves to be truly seen. Sometimes the most important decision we make in life is not to go somewhere or win something, but to walk through a small door from which comes a smell that reminds us of who we were as children. And to meet a person there who will look at us as if he saw us for the first time. If you liked this story, please leave your thoughts in the comments and give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. See you next time.